In the years following World War II and the establishment of the State of Israel, a mass exodus of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries took place that is often overlooked in discussions of 20th century Middle Eastern history and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Between 1948 and the early 1970s, an estimated 850,000 to 1 million Jews left or were expelled from their homes in Arab nations, with the majority departing in the late 1940s and 1950s. This large-scale displacement, sometimes called the Jewish Nakba catastrophe, marked the end of vibrant Jewish communities that had existed in the Middle East and North Africa for over 2,000 years. The roots of this exodus can be traced to rising Arab nationalism and anti-Zionism in the early 20th century, the trauma of World War II and the Holocaust, and the establishment of Israel in 1948. While the experiences of Jewish communities varied across different countries, a common pattern emerged of increasing hostility, legal and economic discrimination, outright violence, and ultimately mass departure, whether through officially sanctioned expulsions or de facto forced migration. Historical background: Jewish communities had deep historical roots across the Middle East and North Africa, dating back to ancient times in some places. Under Islamic rule, Jews generally held dhimmi status as a protected but subordinate religious minority. While their situation was often precarious and marked by periods of persecution, many Jewish communities were able to flourish culturally and economically over the centuries. By the early 20th century, there were thriving Jewish populations in countries like Iraq, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and across North Africa. In Iraq, for instance, Jews made up about a third of Baghdad's population and played prominent roles in commerce and civil service. Alexandria and Cairo hosted large Jewish communities that were deeply integrated into Egyptian society and culture. However, the rise of Arab nationalism and anti-colonial movements began to change the status of Jews in many of these countries. The growth of Zionism and Jewish immigration to Palestine in the early 1900s increasingly led Arabs to view their Jewish neighbors with suspicion. World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire further destabilized the region's political order. The interwar period saw sporadic outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence, such as the 1941 Farhud pogrom in Baghdad. Nazi propaganda and growing connections between some Arab nationalist leaders and Nazi Germany also contributed to rising anti-Semitism. Yet in many places, Jews still felt relatively secure in their position through the 1930s. World War II and its aftermath. World War II marked a crucial turning point. While the Middle East was not a major theater of the war, its effects were deeply felt. In places under Vichy French control, like Morocco and Algeria, Jews faced discriminatory laws. The pro-Nazi regime that briefly took power in Iraq in 1941 further stoked anti-Jewish sentiment there. Most significantly, the horrors of the Holocaust in Europe cast a dark shadow. As news of the genocide reached the Middle East, it instilled fear in Jewish communities. At the same time, many Arabs viewed European Jewish refugees with hostility, seeing them as a threat to the Arab character of Palestine. The end of the war unleashed pent-up nationalist forces across the region. As European colonial powers withdrew, newly independent Arab states embraced ethno-nationalist ideologies that left little room for minorities. The 1947 UN partition plan for Palestine and subsequent establishment of Israel in 1948 brought simmering tensions to a boil. Across the Arab world, riots and attacks targeting Jewish communities broke out. In Aden, 82 Jews were killed in pogroms in 1947. An estimated 150 Jews were killed in Baghdad in 1941. Synagogues and Jewish property were destroyed in many cities. These outbreaks of violence convinced many Jews that they no longer had a future in lands their families had inhabited for generations. Legal and economic persecution. Beyond physical attacks, Jews faced mounting legal and economic persecution in many Arab countries in the late 1940s and 1950s. Discriminatory laws stripped Jews of citizenship, restricted their economic activities, and confiscated their property. In Iraq, a 1950 law allowed Jews to emigrate only if they renounced their citizenship. Their property was frozen and later seized by the government. Egypt passed a series of nationalization laws that disproportionately targeted Jewish-owned businesses. In Libya, Jews were denied the right to vote, hold public office, or acquire new property. These measures, combined with social and economic boycotts, devastated once prosperous Jewish communities. Many Jews lost their livelihoods and faced poverty and harassment. The message was clear: they were no longer welcome in the countries they called home. Faced with violence, legal discrimination, and bleak prospects, the vast majority of Jews in Arab lands chose to leave in the 1950s and early 1960s. The scale and speed of this exodus was staggering. In Iraq, a community of 150,000 Jews dating back to Babylonian times dwindled to just a few thousand by 1952. Egypt's Jewish population fell from 75,000 in 1948 to only 50 in 1970. Of the 38,000 Jews in Libya in 1948, only 100 remained by the 1960s. In Algeria, almost all of the 140,000 Jews left upon independence in 1962. Yemen's ancient Jewish community, which once numbered 50,000, had almost entirely emigrated by 1950. Similar patterns played out across the region in Syria, Lebanon, Tunisia, and Morocco. In most cases, Jews were forced to leave behind property and possessions, allowed to take only a small amount of money and few personal items. This mass displacement created a refugee crisis on a huge scale. While most of these Jews found refuge in the newly established State of Israel, significant numbers also fled to France, the United States, and other Western countries. Their absorption posed major challenges, particularly for Israel, which struggled to accommodate hundreds of thousands of immigrants in its early years. While there were common threads, the experiences of Jewish communities varied across different Arab countries. Iraq. Once home to one of the world's oldest Jewish communities, Iraq saw some of the most dramatic events. After a series of persecutory laws, virtually the entire Jewish population was airlifted to Israel in Operation Ezra and Nehemiah in 1951 to 1952. Egypt. Relatively well integrated before 1948, Egypt's Jews faced increasing hostility after the Suez Crisis in 1956. Many were interned or expelled, with their property confiscated. By the 1960s, only a tiny remnant remained. Libya. Pogroms in 1945 and 1948 devastated the Jewish community. Under independent Libya, Jews faced severe restrictions and eventual expulsion in 1967. Yemen. The already precarious situation of Yemenite Jews deteriorated sharply after 1947. Almost the entire community was airlifted to Israel in Operation Magic Carpet in 1949 to 1950. Morocco and Tunisia. While facing pressure, Jews in these countries had somewhat less traumatic experiences. Many emigrated gradually over the 1950s and 1960s, with small communities remaining to this day. Syria. Severe restrictions were placed on Jews, who were effectively held hostage by the regime. Most eventually left in the 1990s after emigration restrictions were lifted. Lasting impact and legacy. The exodus of Jews from Arab lands had profound and lasting impacts. Demographic transformation. It radically altered the demographics of the Middle East, virtually ending the 2,000-year presence of Jews in many countries and transforming Israel's population. Cultural loss. Centuries-old Jewish cultures and traditions specific to the Arab world were largely lost or dispersed. Economic effects. Many Arab countries lost significant portions of their middle class and skilled professionals. Property disputes. The issue of confiscated Jewish property remains contentious, with many refugees still seeking compensation. Political ramifications. The influx of Middle Eastern Jews significantly shaped Israeli society and politics. Historical narrative. The story of Jewish refugees has become part of competing historical narratives in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Forgotten history. Despite its massive scale, the Jewish exodus from Arab lands has often been overlooked in historical discussions and political discourse surrounding the Middle East. Several factors contribute to this relative neglect. Overshadowing by the Palestinian refugee issue, the displacement of Palestinians in 1948 has received far more attention in international forums and media. Successful integration. Unlike Palestinian refugees, most Jewish refugees were eventually resettled and integrated mainly in Israel. Political factors. Emphasizing this history has been seen by some as detracting from the Palestinian cause. Complex narratives. The varied experiences across different countries make it a complex story to tell. In recent years, There have been growing efforts to bring more attention to this chapter of history. Israel officially commemorates the Exodus on November 30th as a day of remembrance. Some argue that any comprehensive Middle East peace deal should address the claims of Jewish refugees alongside those of Palestinian refugees. The mass exodus of Jews from Arab lands in the mid-20th century marked the end of an era. Communities that had survived and often thrived for millennia disappeared within the span of a few years. This dramatic upheaval reshaped the Middle East's demographics, culture and politics in ways that continue to reverberate today. Thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts on the events covered in this video, please share them in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe for more informative content and check out my next video, where I'll be doing a deeper dive into one of these topics.